Alrighty. Let's get chat over here. Morning, everybody, or, you know, whatever it is, time by you. Let's make this maybe a little bit bigger. Oof. All right, cargo run. So this is Floppy Corgi. Hey, Anders, how's it going? Oh, that was a terrible grab of that window corner. What is going on there? Why does it really want to be in that like bottom left corner? That doesn't make any sense. All right. This is the Corgi game for 0.16. I think the only thing that has changed in it is I removed Bevy Asset Loader. And I removed Bevy Asset Loader because Bevy's Texture Atlas support has gotten a little bit better. One of the reasons that, see if I can pull up the diff here. One of the reasons that I used to prefer Bevy Asset Loader, even when it wasn't like strictly required, is that if I can get up to the asset file. Is that right here? It lets you specify things like tile size, columns, and rows, and whatever. Bevy didn't really used to have as much of an ergonomic way to do that. But now you can do Texture Atlas from grid with the texture. So like this fundamentally not that different from the way Bevy Asset Loader works. So I would rather rely on showing people how to work with the upstream kind of like Texture Atlas layout APIs, because this does exist these days. And if we remove that, then none of these other loads are really that important, in the sense that none of them really need to be Bevy Asset loaded. And then we get to get rid of app state entirely in the application, which makes this even more of a beginner workshop, which is nice. And then loading gets a little bit weird, because I guess it's weird in both sides, right? Because in Bevy Asset Loader, you have this line that is basically like, hey, for the sampler, use this filter and use this wrap or whatever. And in like Bevy's asset server load with settings function, which you have to know exists, you can specify the file, and then you get this like callback, and you have to like kind of figure out what this type is here. Once you figure out the type, you then have to like understand what a descriptor is and stuff like that, which like is fine. It just immediately throws you into like UVW and some other things that aren't really that relevant. Luckily, this has a default implementation, so we get to just do .default. And then I don't think the filter mode is, yeah. So, and then if you wanted to like set other settings, you can do that with the asset usage and whatnot, and is sRGB, but I think that's about it. I think this level of complexity is like bordering on iffy, but it's fine. Where can a new person get started in Bevy? The cheat book is outdated and the examples are not really easy. What do you not find easy about the examples? What is your like what is the difficulty with the examples for you? Have you tried to do something and were unable to do it, or do you just find them to be a lot of code, or like what is your because in general, I view the examples as kind of like a treasure trove of like API examples and stuff. Um, the thing I'm showing right now is actually going to turn into a workshop. So there will be, they are not organized, so they don't go from the basic step by step. Yeah, I guess I would classify them as organized by use case and not by, um, like seniority, I guess, or experience. Do I have a Chrome window open? In Gary's mod, you had all the functions in a wiki. It was really easy. What is the difference between that and I guess like just browsing the docs? I guess in Gary's mod, everything is global and you just have a bunch of functions dumped into like a like some global object or something. So like you don't have to worry about modules. Is that possible? But yeah, the examples are organized by use case. Um, I guess I could see it being difficult if you didn't know what your use cases were going to be. What kind of games do you want to build? Like, why are you learning Bevy? What is your interest in, um, like Bevy in general, right? Do you know Rust? Is another question I have. Like, what is your familiarity with seeing any of this syntax at all? Right? Like, do you understand what this config thing is here? Um, Casual game at first. Oh yeah, casual games at first, and then you want to make an overroll with language learning for casual games. So you just started with Rust. You're used to Lua. Cool. Yeah, I was also asking Thanos, who is asking about the examples and stuff. Um, but yeah, that's cool. So what were you doing with? I guess you started with Gary's mod then. Casual games is like such a wide category too. So on casual games with an overroll with language learning for the casual games. Yeah. I don't use Lua all that much myself. You know Rust, you've been using Bevy, using the cheat book, and then using what you learned, but you couldn't make a snake game. What did you run into with the snake game? Like what was the what problems did you actually encounter? Snake is one of the things that Did I do the upgrade for Snake yet? Let's find out together. I don't think so. Maybe I did. I did the upgrade for tile map. So the way that I organized the Snake game that I built for a workshop is basically like, this is actually an intro to Bevy ECS tile map more than it's a like, well, I'm not trying to get you to build like the perfect Snake game. I'm trying to introduce you to the idea of tile maps. And I did that because in the 2048 game, we already cover how to build a grid. So if you wanted to build a grid out of just like regular sprites and then do it, you could. But we need kind of like a board grid abstraction of some kind. And we can either build that ourselves or we can use a crate. So I chose to go with this as a tile map introduction, which, you know, is a choice for sure. But yeah, this is upgraded to 0.16. I need to do the scripting for everything, which I am in the progress of. But this is one of the later ones that I'm working on. I think it's also one of the bigger ones. Snake turns out to be a decent amount of code, I think. Let's see, Tookie, source. This demo for Snake is 800 lines of code. 700. We'll call it 700. And Floppy Corgi is like 4 to 5. So it's roughly double, I would say, in terms of complexity. You like the ECS, but you're used to making games with old ways. That way, I couldn't even make the controls work. It moves like world coordinates and camera transform that translation got you. Okay. Controls work, coordinates, and translation. So picking where the snake would be, basically, and I guess the camera transformation part of it is, I think I have camera stuff in here, is these like orthographic projections and like the settings inside of them, like that kind of thing. In Floppy Corgi, what I do is I just set it to a specific size. And then I set the scaling mode to the way that I want it for that game specifically. So in that case, it's like, it has to be maximum XY, whatever. Which keeps the entire canvas that I care about on screen. Similar thing for Snake, if I remember correctly. I think this is a square and I size it based on the size of that square. I think 2048 would probably be more applicable, but so it's like the same thing, right? So when you think about the projection and how much of the screen it's going to cover and what it's going to look at on your sort of game world or whatever, I'm kind of thinking about like number of tiles, so like 20 by 20 plus a little bit of space, times the tile size, you know? Yeah, I mean, like the issue isn't Bevy itself in the sense that like there are definitely concepts that are not strictly Bevy related. But I would say that dealing with input in Bevy requires knowing Bevy APIs for input. So in that sense, it like is Bevy, right? If you don't know how to access the buttons for how to, let's see, the controls are here, right? So if you don't know how to query res button input key code, or tell what's been pressed, then that's a problem with Bevy or your understanding of Bevy, right? I could easily see like snake is typically run like in steps, if you will. Um, and in the version that I have here, I kind of like cheap out a little bit in the sense that I run the snake at the same speed, the same tick speed, um, for the entire game. Like it doesn't speed up ever or anything like that, which I think is fine for the workshop. But if you don't know how to like run a system on a timer, then this gets tough too, right? If you don't know about common conditions, and that's all like Bevy API stuff. But yeah, I mean, it sounds like you kind of want the workshops that I'm working on. So, unfortunately, because they are things that I am currently working on and 0.16 isn't out yet, I can't tell you to go look at them and for like another week or two. Um, but until then, I do think the examples are very, very good. Um, they aren't organized in terms of difficulty, but they are organized in terms of use case, right? So if you need to know how to deal with input, there's an input directory and you can see, okay, how do I deal with like keyboard input? Here's how you deal with keyboard input, right? You access the button input resource for key codes. You get that. You check whether it's pressed or whether it was just pressed. If you don't know the difference, you go to the docs and you read, like what does just pressed mean versus pressed. In this case, like this will fire all the time if it's pressed. And if you just press it down, this will fire once, that kind of thing. I think navigating these examples is super important because these are always up to date, right? If you move from Bevy version to Bevy version, for example, and you need to figure out how something changed, you can go into any of these examples, right? 3D shapes, for example. I haven't looked at 3D shapes in a while. If I click the history here, I can see everything in the last cycle, everything since October even. So what? October. This hasn't really changed since the last release. Last release was like November 31st. So this changed, right? This affected 3D shapes. And that was 2 weeks ago. So that's in the current release or in the 0.16 release. And if I really needed to know like which things happened recently, I could do the blame and go, okay, well, 2 weeks ago, this wireframe plugin became wireframe default. So probably need to make that update, right? I think navigating these examples like this is a really important skill to gain. I totally get like it's not a tutorial series, and I get that. But I do think this is a very valuable source of information. However, this is a tutorial series. So, is there a splat on rectangle? No. From corners, from size. So I moved the loading to be core Bevy inside of Flappy Corgi. And then that makes it nice because there's one less dependency. We don't really need Bevy Asset Loader. Noise usage is probably very, very slight, right? Like it's just, you don't even need this to be noise, really. We could just do a sine wave or something. I think using noise is interesting. Noise tends to get used a lot and people tend to need an introduction to it. So I don't really like the noise like APIs from the noise crate, but it is what it is. Yeah, it's not Bevy. Can you make a simple snake game now, like in, for example, Pygame? It is easy since you have the coordinates like you want them. It's just deal with collision, no camera. You get it, 3D. What do you mean you have the coordinates like you want them? Like, if you can do a snake game in Pygame, I have to believe that the coordinates have to be somewhat similar, right? I guess unless they have their own like board/tile abstraction. So if you're using like tile coordinates, like 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 1, that kind of thing. But if you have like a sprite and a size for that sprite and a position to put it at, then you can make them whatever you want, right? So you don't need tiles per se. If you have one by one tiles in a 2D game is terrible. If you have like 100 by 100 tiles, right? And you have a tile at 0, a tile at, 100, a tile at 200, a tile at 300, like that kind of thing. I do think that if you're looking for like a tile-based API, then you do have to build that board abstraction. That's something that I do in that workshop, especially for 2048 too, actually. Let's see, 2048. How much code is 2048 actually? I think 2048 is relatively larger. Yeah, so 750 lines of code, so it's almost as big as Snake. This is one of the reasons that I wanted to chop things down into smaller projects too. Snake, and I kind of think of things in terms of order of magnitude. So like if you've got like 100 line, like when you're really beginning, right? You write hello world, it's like one line, right? You pretty quickly get to like writing programs that are like 10 lines of code, like add 2 numbers, do whatever, right? 100 lines of code is like the next order of complexity for like a newer programmer. Getting to from 100 to 1,000 feels substantial, like it's a decent amount of code. Like 1,000 to 10,000 is like you've got a real project. And then like 10,000 to 100,000 is like you've kind of got like a production thing, and those are huge jumps. What are the advantages of using a tile system for a 2D game instead of not? Like what kind in general? If you have, for example, if the things in your game only operate at tile positions, right? If you've got a grid, then using a grid to interact with it makes more sense. Right? If you've got like Pokemon, for example, right? Pokemon is like a tile-based grid game. Where's my Chrome window? The old Pokemons anyway. Was it any good? Who cares? Not looking for opinions on Pokemon Red. So like this is tile based, right? Like you can go from where Red is standing right here, right, to right in front of Professor Oak. If you go left, but you can't be like half on the edge of this table, right? So if this is the way your game works, then using a tile system or like a tile set of coordinates, right, makes a lot of sense because like this could be 5-5 and this would be like 4-5, right? And if you're saying, okay, move it from 5-5 to 4-5, that is very clear in terms of the end user API that you're using. And then you can't put these characters or the tables or whatever in the wrong spot, right? I don't necessarily mean tile map when I say a grid either, right? Like there's no reason for the player sprites here to be in the tile map, if that makes sense. Whereas the floor behind them and like other things are probably part of the actual tile map. What I just mean is like a grid in general. Grid is important for, say, a snake game. Do you have to deal with both camera and world coordinates to create a tile-like grid? No. One unit in a 2D game in Bevy is a pixel. Right? So if you have a world, like, you effectively have world coordinates, right? So if you have a sprite that is 100 by 100, that is 100 units by 100 units, right? So if you round everything to 100 units, right, then you have a grid, right? Instead of putting something at 78, that thing would go at 100, right? Like that kind of thing. You don't need like a whole abstraction to be able to do that. The camera will change how that area appears on screen, right? Let's see. I have a camera in here. Let's take a look at the camera here. So here I have canvas size X and canvas size Y, right? And if we run this, this is like a well-defined size of playing area, right? Like I've got, I forget what I said it was in the actual data, but it's like 460 by 240 or something like that, right? So my sprites are fairly small, but you can see it's like obviously not displaying at 480, right? Like this is not 480 pixels. This is a 4K monitor. And it's almost halfway across the monitor. So like that is a significant number of pixels. What the camera does is, let's say I cut this. Let's multiply this by 2 and run it again. So basically I've said that my camera should be showing 2 times the pixels on any side. So see how the game hasn't changed, like the logic hasn't changed, where everything is hasn't changed, right? Everything in the world is still positioned where it's supposed to be positioned. And all of that positioning is done kind of relative to that canvas size. But none of that, like the camera doesn't affect where things are. It only affects what shows in the window. So in that sense, like the camera really doesn't matter, right? Things can be big or small or whatever, but when you're thinking about your game, you're always thinking about your game in like world units and stuff. You're not thinking about, for the most part, you aren't thinking about what the camera is going to do. Because like, it doesn't matter if this is 20 times like the number of pixels, right? It's just zooming out basically, right? And now it's like super small. But everything still is in the right, it's all still in the same position, right? We just see more of the field. So cutting this down to just the size you want it to be only is affecting what shows, right? It's not affecting the logic of like where the corgi is in relation to the pipes and stuff. Except for the fact that my window wants to like jump around today for some reason. Maybe I've disconnected this monitor and reconnected it too many times. But yeah, so you see how like the game logic and where things are positioned, um, like that happens in a world space that isn't related to the camera. If you can think of a theoretical grid that is like 0 to 200, if you place something at 100, that is always going to be halfway between 0 and 200 no matter what. If you have a camera that shows the area from 0 to 200, then 100 is in the middle of what's being rendered. If you have a camera that shows negative 200 to 200, then what you have is a thing that is rendering 3/4 of the way across the screen. But it's not in a different place, right? It is in the same place. You're just changing where the camera is. I think overall I'm pretty happy with this in terms of like workshop preparation. Do we want to go with sea green from Bevy? I guess. Doesn't really matter. I've got children, pipes, despawn. A lot of these systems are fairly small, which I really like for kind of an intro like workshop, right? Like this is a system that only moves pipes to the left. So if you have a pipe and a transform, then take that transform, move it to the left some number. And this is in fixed update, so this goes to the left, basically the same rate, right? I do introduce Bevy transform interpolation here. I think that's a good thing. I think that's basically required. And I say it's basically required because it's not really something that you want everybody to deal with on their own. It's not like useful code to write. But I do want to get people into the idea of like, there's this fixed update thing. And if you write game logic, it should probably be in fixed update. And if you write like rendering logic, it could be an update, right? This separation is something that's really easy to not find out for a year. The other thing about using a grid or some kind of board or tile or whatever is like if you're going to do collision, so to speak, doing collision based on pixel values means you have a lot more granularity than you need. Whereas if you're doing something with tiles and tile-based positions and you have like 0, 0, and 1, 1, then you know 0, 0, and 1, 1 are right next to each other, right? Whereas like you're not putting things at 102 and 98. How are you rendering the sprites? Your problem was getting the player snake's position. You tried using the camera's transform. You don't need the camera for transforms. 2D game, your camera's going to be defaulted to looking at 0, 0. It's going to default to being some size. It doesn't matter. How I'm rendering sprites in general is just using spawn. It's the same in all of these, right? So this is not actually a sprite. It's a mesh 2D. So let's find a sprite. Here's a sprite. This sprite has a bunch of components that probably aren't relevant on it. And then it has this transform. And it has like the sprite, right? So I say that this corgi should be some size. This size happens to be 25. I know off the top of my head. See, I've just set this to 25. So I always want my player character to be like 25 by 25, no matter what this texture size is. This texture is actually a 500 by 500 texture. So it's a little oversized for the use case, but that's fine. And then this transform is world position coordinates, right? Because this doesn't have a parent, right? This doesn't have anything else affecting its transform. Then this canvas size I've defined as 480 by 270. So negative 480 over 4 is about a quarter from the left-hand side of the canvas. That's why whenever we run this, the corgi always shows up like at that quarter point across the screen, right? Because I've defined the area in which I want to work, and I've said, okay, I'm going to offset the corgi from that position, right? And because we're looking at 0, 0 in the middle of the screen, right? If I take the amount of space that I want to render at some point, and I move from 0, 0 in the middle of the screen left a quarter of that distance, then it will always be at that 1/4 spot, right? And you can change this to be whatever you want. Like I could put it anywhere. And again, like when we talk about where the camera is, the camera doesn't matter. Like this scaling doesn't matter in terms of where this thing is placed. So if I multiply this by 2 again, right, and we run this again, then you can see that there is a center position still. We're still centered on 0, 0, right? And there is still, like, it's still moved to the left the same space, right? It is still canvas size dot x over 2 or over 4 or whatever. So that is like what, 480 over 4 is 120. So it's always going to be negative 120 statically. Like no matter what the camera is doing, this corgi is always at negative 120 pixels to the left of center. The camera doesn't affect where the corgi is in world space. The camera is only affecting how much of the world we see. Right? So you don't need to get the camera transform, right? You can just decide your game is going to be a 1920 by 1080 game or a 480 by 270 game. And then you set that camera to make sure that that space is visible. And then you just do your offsets off of that. Right? For tile coordinates in Bevy, would you align it with Bevy's system where 0, 0 is center, and then you can go negative or positive, or would you have a 0, 0 with tile starting from bottom left corner? I've done it both ways. I don't really have an opinion for which one is better, personally. I think that it's kind of fine either way. You know? I know that some tile-based systems like Bevy UCS Tile Map will start with 0, 0 and use U32s for those coordinates. If you're building your own tile grid system and you use U32s, then doing math on U32s requires you to do things like checked subtraction, because you don't want to do 0 minus 1, right? I find that from a math perspective, if I have to do something like, let's say, Minesweeper, right? I just built Minesweeper the other day. Let's run this. Hopefully it runs. Yeah, there we go. So we've got Minesweeper here, right? And I can click anywhere in this and it's fine. And I have to do this like 9 tile surrounding check, right? Like if I click here, I have to check all of these 9 surrounding tiles, which means that I have to do tile -1, right, to get to this tile. And if you're down here and you use U32s, you have to be careful about the fact that you could go negative, right? Because if you subtract and you don't do a checked subtraction on a U32, that will panic. I mean, it only panics in debug, but, you know, it is what it is. Ta-da! So that's Minesweeper. This is actually using Bevy ECS tile map though. So Bevy ECS tile map uses a U32. So I actually am doing that logic. But it's really, I think, a personal preference. I don't think that there's a hard, like, this is always better than that kind of vibe. Let's see, where's the checks happening here? Pick tile, trigger targets. Yeah. So here's some of the logic. I need to format this code. But yeah, you see me doing a lot of like, if the next position is within the map bounds, then we can get it, right? If you pause wrapping add signed, right? And within map bounds. So like if you use a U32, you have to like check is the only thing. If you use an I32, you don't necessarily have to check, but you have to make sure that your tile access or whatever grid system you're using can handle giving back a value that is outside of the map, right? In particular, for Bevy ECS tile map, the tile storage is actually just one vec behind the scenes. So you have to do a check about whether it's within the bounds or not first. Because if you don't, you'll get an index array access error. So it really depends on how you want to build it. Really depends on what you're building. But at the end of the day, I think it's a personal preference. I don't think I have any other comments left about this. I'm using .0 in a lot of places here. This velocity could have a deref on it, right? Deref and deref mute. I feel like deref and deref mute are semi-advanced topics and not strictly required. So I don't think I'm going to spend the time teaching them. Because, like, I think, especially for people who are just getting started, just typing .0 is more understandable. Right? Like, can I bring up my type inlay hints? Oh, did I stop Rust Analyzer? I've been getting into the habit of stopping Rust Analyzer. Thanks, that answered your questions. Perfect. Let me turn my little AC unit on. Yeah, so we end up with like mute velocity, and velocity is like technically just a value but wrapped with a new type. So like dereffing on this makes a lot of sense. But people who are just learning might not really understand what an enum is, or like what a tuple struct is, or anything like that. So like making them write the .0 instead of teaching them how to skip the .0 with deref mute feels like the right angle on the complexity. I feel like truncate exists, right? And truncate is .xy. Truncate is also like confusing. I should at least be consistent, I guess. I'm pretty sure custom size is already a vec2, so I don't know why I had .xy there. Pipe translation, I think these either become .truncate or .xy. They're the same thing. I think truncate is probably a little bit more confusing, especially when you're reading it and you don't know what truncate is supposed to be doing. Let's run this with debug colliders to make sure that I didn't just mess it up by just randomly refactoring. Looks good to me. Like truncate is fine, but it's one of those like, it's just a name for XY at this point. What major updates should we expect since Bevy 0.15.3 to 0.16? Major updates. Well, I've got a video that's going to drop whenever 0.16 drops. So look out for that. But in the meantime, the website, if you go to the release content, 0.16 release notes, this is basically all of the features that are going to get talked about in the final release blog post. Default query filters, really cool. Default query filters is effectively like entity disabling. So you can end up having like prefabs, if you will, which I'm actually pretty excited about because I think, I haven't tried this yet, but I think that with Skeen, so with the Blender stuff, you can start labeling things in Blender like as prefabs. They will come in disabled by default if you want to spawn in like a set of prefabs, and then you can go look for those prefabs and like clone them into the world, which will be pretty cool. So this is entity disabling, entity cloning, and like a default query filter is the infrastructure that powers disabling. There's some reflection stuff that's pretty cool. Gizmos are retained, but it's not really like a huge change. You can just now .spawn gizmos instead of running them all the time. There's a new Bevy input focus crate that's pretty cool. I didn't talk about that in the video. I could have, but I feel like I'm waiting for Bevy's like text input UI stuff to get a little bit more mature. Procedural atmospheric scattering is very cool, but it will only be applicable to some games. This is like sunrise, sunset kind of stuff. Bindless and just general, like if you go from 0.15 to 0.16, you effectively, by default, assuming that you aren't messing with the rendering pipeline at all, get a bunch of GPU-driven updates for rendering, which will increase the performance of all of your Bevy applications and is just like generally a great thing. So that's what this bindless in as bind group is part of. Basically, instead of sending like 20 individual textures to the GPU, it packs them all up into a buffer and sends the buffer. Immutable components are new. Immutable components will allow you to build indices or indexes, whatever you want to say, and guarantee that you won't miss any values. So in current Bevy, if you mutate a component, it won't fire any observer. There's no like on mutate, right? But there is on insert and there is on remove. So what you can do is have an observer for like on remove and on insert and maintain an index with perfect like clarity of truth, if that makes sense, which is really cool. This is used as the basis for like the parent-child relationships. Because those are now the generic relationship component as well, or the trait. Multi-draw, indirect, and stuff like that is really cool. Curves now have derivative access patterns. I don't know if any of you have been watching the Saturday streams, but one of the things that I ran into was we're using a dynamic character controller, and we have platforms driven by animation clips using curves in Bevy 0.15. But the downside of that is those are transform-based animation clips. So it will like warp a platform from position to position, technically speaking. Derivative access patterns allow us to derive from the start and end position in that animation clip. We can just write with derivative on the end and get the velocity instead of the position change, which allows us to then drive Avian's linear velocity using the same curve that we defined as a position, which is very, very cool. forward decals, and also I forget what the other one is called. There's forward decals and clustered decals. Forward decals are a little bit more basic. They're like if you put a plane and a material on that plane and you define a distance from that, or a quad, sorry, not a plane. It's not infinite. If you put it like a quad or a rectangle, you put some material on that quad or rectangle, and then you define the distance away from that quad at which it will affect other meshes. Then you can end up with like graffiti on top of a broken wall kind of vibe. Decals, very cool. So you can use that for like, if you have a tiling texture and you want to make it look less tiling, you can put decals all over the place. They're really cheap because they're just quads all over the place. And then it'll be like, oh, here's a bunch of dirt on that wall. It doesn't look as tiled, you know? Clustered decals are like projected decals, if that makes sense. They don't work on Mac OS and they don't work on web currently, but they are much higher quality than forward decals. Forward decals are cool. They're cheap. Clustered decals are high quality and they're limited to like Windows and Linux, I think, right now. Source location tracking is very cool, but probably more people are just going to like see that in error messages than anything else. I guess there's an asset change query filter now. Anamorphic bloom, we already had bloom. Relationships are huge. Relationships are, so in 0.15 we had parent and children. That became a generic relationship, which is very cool. So if we go to relationship, like you can just derive relationship for any component that you want to now. So parent became child of, and children stayed the same. So if you insert child of on something, then you end up with the other side of that getting filled in, if that makes sense. So if you have an entity, you say it's a child of this entity, and you insert child of on that entity down there, then the parent will get its children vec filled out automatically by Bevy. That's why this immutable components like indexes updating thing was really cool, because it guarantees that all of that information is accurate as soon as you want to access it. We get new spawn APIs and bundle effects. I think this release note is already filled out, so I can just show it. That's this like children macro here. Huge. This children macro is huge. And what this means is like with new bundle effects, you can actually just return bundles from functions, right? Anything that impulse bundle. So you can start returning hierarchies from functions, which means that you don't need to copy and paste buttons around your entire application anymore. You can just say, this is a button, or this returns a bundle that is a button. I'm super excited about that. And this extends to the new relation stuff, and it has some advanced stuff for spawning iterators and stuff like that. So very, very cool. There's more coming there too. We currently have a number of different things. I think constructs are still coming. So constructs, I think, are the next thing that would land in 0.17. I don't know that for sure, but I think that's true. And then BSN is coming at some point on top of all of that stuff. So that's worked towards all of the UI editor, etc. things. Called specialization and mesh tags. We talked about GPU-driven rendering stuff. Some new documentation things. Transform propagation got better. Experimental support for Weasel or WESL shaders is now in. That's very cool. That's like a... If you've worked with Bevy shaders, you know that the WGSL implementation it uses has like a bunch of imports and stuff. Weasel is like a community-driven... I want the website. They have a website now. This is like a community-driven way to define all of that kind of stuff. So very exciting. It may turn out that in 0.17... everything turns into Weasel shaders. inside of Bevy, which would be very, very, very cool. I don't know that that is true, but it seems like a direction that Bevy could very easily go. No standard support. No standard support is really cool. Bevy has been run on Game Boy Advance. I've done that personally. Playdate, which I've done personally. ESP32, which I haven't done yet. Bare Metal, which I haven't done yet. And I think there was some other stuff, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But like, where's my Game Boy? My Game Boy is here. I'll give you a sneak peek. Oh, did I just hit the brightness? Perfect. That's what I wanted to do. Turn my brightness down. Here's your sneak peek if you can see it. Then choose a ship, whatever. Shoot, things like that. It's hard to see on showing it like that, but that's a Bevy game running on a Game Boy, which is very cool. Some better required syntax, GPU tracing, two-phase occlusion culling is experimental, and we get errors. So you can handle errors in systems now. There's a new Bevy result type. You can now use the question mark. You can do that in observers. You can do that in systems. You can do that in commands. You can do that, and then like single, like the system parameters are all also use the same unified error handling. So there's a bunch of stuff, which is all very cool. I'm very excited. Bevy releases are always great. Since I just did that, let me do an overview of, let's see, is there any unwraps in here that we could get rid of? I guess those are actual unwraps. These sprites always have that size. So those make sense because we're always setting the custom size here. Like theoretically, if you didn't set the custom size, then this wouldn't exist, but we are doing that, so. I don't think we have expect in here at all. Yeah. So for these unwraps, we could use the question mark instead. I don't think it's that important. This is also like mostly in debug, right? The only time we actually need it is for the pipe collider here. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of like debug features, in which case unwrap doesn't really matter. And then pipes plugin is cool. This is just positioning pipes based on the noise value. I guess I don't need the transform interpolation here because I set it globally. I think setting it globally is the right choice. Then we don't need to put it on everything individually. Because everything you can see here is supposed to be interpolated. So that's all good. I guess we could technically abstract like some of this a little bit, but I don't really feel like it's that important. I also like not over abstracting in things like this. Um, So yeah, we're using the canvas size all over the place here. We're basically saying like spawn it outside of the canvas size to the right, let it go through the canvas size. If it's past the canvas size on the left, then despawn it. Using the inherent recursive despawn, I don't think we have any. Transform interpolation needs to get removed now that I removed it from that other thing. Okay, cool. I should stop calling things final. Let's say 0.16 RC.5. One of the funny things about doing workshops like these is that I could record this right now, but if I do cargo add like Bevy at 0.16 RC.5 or whatever, it looks really weird for the next 6 months or so. Okay, so we've got floppy corgi. Let me do a rundown. I think asteroids is something that I should look back into. Right now we have couldn't fit table into 8 columns. Oh, the size, yeah. 2048, snake, block breaker, floppy corgi, and minesweeper. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 5 games. I think that's a pretty decent set for 0.16. I do want to add one more thing to block breaker, which is the whatchamacallit, the thing where like if you hit it on the side of a paddle, it goes in a certain direction more. But I'll do that later, I think. How big is this one? This one is pretty small. 277 lines of code. So block breaker is probably going to be the first one that I script. I think getting some quick wins in for shipping this is going to be really useful. You can see I'm using the canvas size thing again here. I'm saying like, hey, I want a 600 by 1080 sized canvas. Are those 5 games going to be in examples or in Discord later after the release? They're going to actually, so I'm going to like fully script them out. They are on GitHub if you want to like take a look at them. But the thing that I do is I post them on Rust Adventure under the workshops. This is how I fund all of my work in general. So if you see me streaming or making videos or doing, you know, Bevy release stuff or This Week in Bevy or anything like that, this is what funds all of that work. And it's a set of workshops for learning Rust stuff. So people can use like their corporate educational budgets to put into this if they have them. And that's really kind of what it's priced for. But again, if you look at the workshops, so I need to get rid of the Bevy workshop, but going to random workshop, all of the content is still here. So if you can't afford it for whatever reason, you can go through and read all the lessons anyway. But if you want to access the videos, because it does cost me money to serve the videos too, that is behind the paywall. But that's how I fund all of the work that I do in general. So that's where these are going to go. I'm going to script them. I'll record them. They'll go up in terms of lessons as a sequence of the 5 games. And they'll have everything up there. They are also on GitHub. So if you go to like Rust Adventure, Block Breaker, right? Like the code is all here, right? I try to make everything accessible because I know that there's a lot of people that can't afford to actually like pay for the educational content. Um, but for the people who have, you know, like San Francisco jobs or whatever, and have corporate educational budgets, I do try to price things so that they can use that to support me instead of like paying out of pocket. I appreciate that, Anders. I do. So Blockbreaker probably going to be the first one that I script, honestly, because 300 lines of code is half of the other ones. And I think the only thing... Actually, there's a new... So one of the things that we do need... I used Avian in this workshop. I believe. Yeah, I used Avian in this workshop. So we do some collision stuff, right? So here's ball collision. But Avian has to have a release before I can actually be like, hey, this is the thing. What do you mean by script block breaker? I mean, if you look at the stuff on Rust Adventure, for example, it has a bunch of workshops. These workshops have, oh, that's a bug. These workshops have like lessons, right? So if you look at the playlist here for this workshop, this has step-by-step lessons walking you through how to build the entire project. I mean, these scripts, like specifically, if you click into this and you want to know about whatever this is Serde and Serde YAML and stuff. This will tell you how to add the dependency, how to work with it, what the serialized stuff does, etc., etc. So like, when I say script, what I mean is a workshop as a series of a number of lessons writing that content. I don't mean like mods, which I get is confusing in the context of games. So actually, there was something that I want to look at here in terms of Avian. Avian just got a new API. Let's see, Avian. I haven't looked at this too deeply yet, but I am very excited about it. You can spawn an observer for anything. So I think for us, we want an observer on the ball. Because we don't actually care about anything else at the moment. So let's try to update. This is currently using some commit. Let me pull my window over here so I don't... This is the other thing about workshops too. If I rely on a third-party crate like Avian, then it has to publish an actual release before I can actually ship the workshop, because telling people to go like, hey, go use Avian git revision 7211 EC FEBB, you know, like that doesn't work. So let's bump this to 0.5. Let's, I think this is the right. Nope, that was the wrong one. Got too many desktops. Which one is it? This one? Put this here, move this over, move that back. So we'll run cargo update. This will pull the new versions of stuff. We'll cargo run. This should hopefully work. I think because there's that new observer API, it's the better option for doing like small amounts of collisions. I think you would probably still want to use like colliding entities or whatever in the other case, but or like collision events, right? Like raw collision events with an event reader is going to be more performant, but so we get on collision start and on collision end. Question about whether we should actually, which one we should use. I am going to start with end because I want the block to disappear once we've hit it, not as we are hitting it, if that makes sense. I think if we do on collision start, we can run into the issue where like the ball could intersect with a block and the collision has started, but because the collision is starting, then you don't actually hit the block and the ball doesn't bounce off. So we're going to do on collision end in this case. Triggered after the solver. Usage could look like this. So it's unclear exactly what the best practices are here, but I do think that having this observer API makes a lot of sense, especially for something this simple. And by simple, I don't mean like easy. I mean like there is one thing colliding with other things. And then we get to use these queries and stuff. Does this give us the trigger.entity pressure plate, right? Trigger on collision start player query. So the thing we are putting the observer on is the target and the what is trigger.0? We'll find out. Still got a couple dependencies. So theoretically, we wouldn't need this anymore. And the ball, we probably need a couple of these queries. Where do we have the ball? Here's the ball. So we would dot observe here, theoretically. This would be on collision end, is what I said I wanted to use. We have to check to see if it's a brick or a respawn area. Or technically also the paddle, right? At some point. So for now, we'll do bricks and respawn areas. I think we want all of this except for the balls query. Yada, yada. Okay, let's get rid of player query here. Let's get rid of this balls query. Then these things come in. Trigger.0 feels weird. I wonder if that was a mistype. Yeah, tuple index access isn't supported. So I don't know where that API came from. This is going to be the ball itself, right? And then we are basically going to do the same thing. But the question is, trigger.0 is an entity. That's really interesting. I wonder, I'm going to look at the definition for trigger in a second here. I don't think this compiles. Entity is the wrong one. Hang on. We need to do target. And then does that mean there's trigger dot? Let's also log out trigger dot event just for kicks. So ball collision is a thing we got rid of. So let's do ball collision. This is no longer around, right? Run this. So that never fires, it looks like. Did I put this onto the right thing? Right, spawn, circle, collider is here, children is here. Children should probably be all the way at the bottom. Avian 2D from main. The API is here. The question is, when would this fire? Let's start with on collision start, I guess. So possibly bug situation. What is the collision events enabled? That is something we need. So this will have to have collision events enabled. We're going to get rid of colliding entities because we don't actually need it. Not if we're using the new API. Cool. So let's go back to on collision end. Let's get rid of colliding entities. For these two things, which we don't need to loop over anymore, which is also nice. Right? No dereference needed. That's also nice. This is not what I wanted. I don't know why I wrote that. This is trigger.0. Trigger.0 is such a weird way to write that, it feels like. I don't like that. I don't like that from a pedagogical perspective. Because it's kind of like, okay, what is .0? And I know we just renamed a bunch of stuff. To be more explicit. Does it implement deref? Does it implement WEB trigger for EB new self still a trigger? The trigger unless it implements something doesn't have. Here's deref. Here's our deref implementation. Okay, so derefs to event. An event for collision must be a tuple struct. That's the on collision end, right? On collision end. Yeah. On collision end is a tuple struct with a 0 value. I think I'm going to include the dot event in here. I want this to be more clear. I don't like the deref here. I feel like I would consider using the deref here if .0 was more descriptive. .0 isn't descriptive. It's possible that we don't need that and that this has deref on it, which is not true, it looks like. So I'm just going to be explicit. I like being explicit, saying, hey, this is coming from the event. This is significantly more readable, in my opinion. .0 looks weird. .0 doesn't, how do I frame this? There's no way for somebody without this .event.0 who doesn't know how trigger works or how to look up the data I just looked up to figure out what .0 is, right? And the type on .0 is just going to be entity, right? So let t equals trigger.0, right? So this is just going to be entity, and people are going to be like, okay, what entity is that? So I think this is important. So we're getting collisions now for the ball. And the collisions work. And I have gotten myself into a mess with the the ball. Let's see if the ball hits the respawn point. It works against bricks. It does not work against the respawn until it goes the other way. Is that what just happened there? Because we're on collision end. That's a really interesting note. I think having let's check the behavior for on collision start. I feel like it makes sense for on start for sensors. I feel like it makes sense for on end for bricks. So on the respawn area, it now enters, and if it hits, then it hits. I have programmatically coded this to exactly be a vertical result on that ball, which is mildly impressive. That's really not great. Okay, so all of this works. I think on collision start is fine. We do have to influence the ball if it hits a paddle in some way. So I feel like this is going to get messy in a way. Like, I think for this scenario, it's fine. But let's do single. What are we going to need? We're going to need the transform, right? Did we get the collision information? I want to say no. I want to say on collision end doesn't give us any of that information. So if we wanted that information or some semblance of that information, we would need I think it's fine to implement a from transform to transform center. So given the paddle and given the ball, if we look up the transform for both of those things, then we can go from this transform to that transform and have that vector impact the velocity of the ball. It's a little mathy, but I think that will have the impact that we want. So let's do with paddle. We also need the transforms. So this is going to be a little bit awkward. Like we just need all of them. What am I trying to do? The goal here. So one of the things that I would like to do, and I don't know if we should disable the one of the things I would like to do is when it hits the paddle, that it adds some direction to the ball. That's what I want to do. I think it's not critically important that we do that in a sophisticated way. It's not critically important that this is like amazingly fun to play or anything. So I am roughly choosing to do a very simple thing, or what I'm thinking of is very simple thing, and take the transform of the paddle itself and the transform of the ball. And when they collide, so when the ball collides with the paddle, we take the transform of the paddle and the transform of the ball at the time of collision, and we influence the velocity of the ball based on that direction. So right now, the only way to influence the direction is to like nail it right on the corner of the paddle. So the other thing we could do is have the paddle be like an extended capsule kind of thing, or like an ellipse, so to speak, right? So instead of having, I think, I don't have the colliders showing here right now. Let's go to physics. And this might be a better option, actually. So we should consider it. So like right now, we have the rectangle collider, right? And that's fine. What we could do instead, I think, is paddle. We have a collider here, and we could do collider ellipse, half width, half height. I'm going to assume that these are like the same thing as the rectangle. So we could do this instead. It makes it a little awkward, Nope, that's not the half height. But it gives us directionals. So this would be 10 and this would be 100. So effectively what I'm trying to do is the same thing that this is trying to do. It just looks a little bit weird if, I guess, the ball goes into the paddle at the edges there. And that's not the way that it's actually implemented, right? Like, an ellipse collider is not the way that Arkanoid or anything else do it. But it does have the same effect, so maybe we just do that. The goal isn't to teach math. So I think that actually just doing that is going to be the right solution. We do have another option. The other option would be to basically like find the collision point between the ball and the paddle, and then the vector from the paddle to the ball, like the center of the paddle to the ball or whatnot. We could use that vector to influence the ball's direction in certain ways. So if it hits further away from the center of the paddle, give more horizontal movement, like that kind of thing. I don't think that algorithm is particularly interesting in terms of the workshop. Like, I don't think people really care about the math. So I think leaving it out is just fine. We'll just say like, hey, this is a shortcut. And we can leave the math to a different workshop. Because I think people who want to learn the math will go to a dedicated math workshop. Which I don't know if I'm ever going to put on Rust Adventure or not. The content that I put on Rust Adventure is mostly about learning Rust, the language, and things like Rust related things. That said, I have had the desire to put like WGSL stuff up there. So like WGSL and math is like related to Bevy. So like people who come for Bevy could also want to learn that, but then it's also like not Rust, so it doesn't really fit on the site. I've thought about this quite a bit, actually. I think at the end of the day, what I'm going to end up with is like the one subscription that I have will give you access to like a suite of sites rather than just the one site. And then there will be like a WGSL site, right? Or like a Leptos site, or like a, like if the categories are big enough to have multiple workshops themselves. Because I think people understand that better as well, right? Because if you go to, I'm getting a little bit off track into like Rust Adventure marketing stuff right now, but if you go to Rust Adventure, you expect to learn like the Rust language, right? I think that's what most people would expect. If you go to like Bevy Adventure, you would expect to learn Bevy. If you go to WGSL Adventure, you would expect to learn WGSL. And those are very well packaged, concrete, like come here if you want this kind of things. And the way that I've packaged things in the past is more like, here's everything. And people really don't like making decisions, right? People really like having a, here's step 1 for the basics, here's step 2 for the next step, here's step 3 for the next step. And for a language, I can do that, right? For the language, I can see like, here's the hello world, here's how you declare variables, here's functions, here's, you know, structs and enums, here's, you know, whatever. I can move down in that way. You can't do that as well if you have like Rust language and Bevy and WGSL and Leptos and Clap, and because they're all different paths, right? And what I've figured out over time is that people, even if there are multiple paths, don't like choosing paths on one site. They will pick a site and then do the site. So I think that's what I'm going to do in the future. I think I'm actually going to split that site out basically white label my own stuff, have one entry point for everything, and then have separate domains for separate topics. I don't know if that was interesting for anybody else, but I think about this stuff quite a lot because this is how I fund all of this work. So getting it to people is really important. So we have if let, then do this, if let, then do this. I think the if lets are the right thing to do. I think I should write it in here though. This is a brick. It's not a brick because we didn't do that. We could do that, right? Like this doesn't need to be a query for empty. This could be a query for entity. But realistically, we already have the entity. We don't need it. So I think that this is better. Because otherwise it looks like we're fetching an entity with an entity, and that's not what we're doing. We're just checking. And I think the if let is the right thing to do because people get a little bit confused if you use like bool.then or something like that. Similarly, we use double for loops here because people are familiar with them. I actually prefer Cartesian product here. And I do teach Cartesian product sometimes, but anytime I deal with indices, I like to get rid of the indices. So it's not super important that we use linear velocity for the paddle controls, but if we do use linear velocity, this does need to be in fixed update, which it is. Small amount of text, etc. I think this is good to go from an implementation perspective. I think this can be scripted now. I think this one is going to be fairly small in terms of number of lessons, which I'm very happy about. We don't have any unwraps, right? It's a single file. It's about 300 lines of code. Most of it is actually just spawning stuff, but we do get to talk a lot about how to position things. Do get to talk a lot about, you know, for example, how to set up the camera orthographic stuff. We have this background. Collisions. This is kind of like intro to avian, I guess. So it's a little weird that it would be so early in like the course structure. I think that for most games, people don't use Bevy's built-in collision anyway, so I'm not too worried about that, actually. I think that most beginners will reach for avian before they reach for Bevy's AABB 2D stuff. This children thing is kind of like a neat little, hey, we're doing children, but like it's not really that important. Like if you just got rid of this, it wouldn't be that impactful. But we do get to talk about the children macro, which I like. I don't think there's any minimum velocity, which means that you could end up in a situation where you ended up like cutting the how do I say this? You could end up in a situation where you end up cutting the speed of this ball down a ton. The ball looks a little jumpy, actually. Is that a release thing too? Ball's looking a little jumpy there. We don't control the ball movement. And I am currently under the impression that if you use, say, linear velocity or whatever, that Avian will handle interpolation. Let's get rid of the physics debug plugin. That's just going to be something that we like show people when we're talking about colliders. That's not actually going to be like behind a feature flag or anything. State scoped. Could talk about you can log out the state scope transitions. I don't think it's that important because the state scope transitions here aren't complicated. So I think we'll skip that. Talk about it in a different workshop. These on enters and whatever are really important. State scoped stuff is really important. Yeah. I think this is generally good. And then setup handles, background sprite, camera spawn, and the colliders in general. I guess this doesn't need to be children, right? This can be 4 independent spawns. And I'm like 50-50 on it right now. Because like, technically this is defining the playing field and spawning it like this doesn't actually matter. Or shouldn't matter. Right. The difference between those two things should not matter at all because that transform was 0, 0. I know I said I wanted to check the release performance, but I don't want to do that right now. So this is all good. That's the same exact thing in general. We technically don't need the bottom one. It's just there for completeness. Like if for some reason it got out past the sensor or whatever. We're never moving all of these in sequence, so I think this is the way that we're going to spawn this. I think that the separate spawns probably make more sense. Because we never use the parent anyway. Then we've got sprite for the canvas size. This is just like defining the playing area by putting a white sprite in. This is the respawn area, same kind of thing. We're just kind of like placing it in a semi-arbitrary position. Maybe I try to clean this math up before I actually write the workshop. Sensor is super important. New game does a respawn of the paddle. And the ball. And we spawn the bricks. We'll kind of do the same thing here that we did on the ball. Like, hey, we kind of want an outline, but it's not strictly speaking like super interesting or important. Paddle speed. Linear velocity is fine. We're using avian. I think the only question I have here is why is the ball jerky at the moment? I don't think there's an option for that. Yeah. We're not going to change like the length unit of the physics or anything. I think that'll just be confusing. So I think this is good to go. What else do we have? Snake is, I think, ready to go. Snake is interesting because it uses Bevy ECS tile map, which is, it's a choice to be sure. I think that the reason I use Bevy ECS tile map here is that we need a board abstraction anyway, and I didn't want to rebuild one from scratch for the workshop. I think introducing Bevy ECS tile map, saying, hey, here's some tile bundles and stuff. I know I'm going to break myself because I maintain Bevy ECS tile map, and I know that I'm going to switch it to required components right after 0.16 drops. So I know that this tile bundle thing is going to break. So Snake will probably be one of the later workshops that I script, because I'll try to get that required components release out, rewrite this, and then use that. Are we using asset loader here? We are. Do we need to? Not really. This is the Snake Atlas layout. So grass and snake are texture atlas layouts. We can definitely do that. So we could get rid of Bevy asset loader here. That kind of like brings up like, when would I use Bevy asset loader in a workshop? Because I feel like in my own projects, in my actual games, I reach for Bevy asset loader all the time. And I think that's fine because I think that for me, I want all of my assets loaded before I use them. And Bevy Asset Loader gives me ways to do that. It also gives me like easy ways to track the loading of stuff, which we're not doing here. We also don't need to because these assets are so small. So that does bring up an interesting point about when to use Bevy Asset Loader. Or an interesting question, anyway. I think it's fine to use it for this. I think that... Let me update this to 15. Cargo update. Cargo run. I think Minesweeper is probably ready to go too. I'm starting to actually script these, so that's why I'm going over these and being like, is this actually ready or is this like mostly ready? Because I can script them before the stable release actually ships. RC5 is going to be the release at this point. I think one of the things that Bevy Asset Loader does really nicely is it keeps assets in memory, if that makes sense. It's not really what I mean, but it keeps them loaded. If you have a handle to an asset that you're not using, like that apple, and if it was like a heavy asset, like something that really took time to load, and you despawned it and then respawned it a few frames later, you would unload that handle, delete it, and then recreate it, which might mean reloading it from disk. Bevy Asset Loader helps a lot with that kind of thing, so it's really useful if you're doing like heavy GLTF loading or something like that. So this should all just work. Hopefully there's no bugs in the RC3 to RC5 update. I didn't upgrade to RC4. I consider RC4 to be generally bugged. Cool. And then new game. I know people don't really like UI stuff, but I think I want to do a UI workshop at some point. I think for games like this, most of the people going through them don't want UI stuff. So all this is good. It does put some restrictions on like the way the snake can move. It can only move from tile to tile, right? So, right, it's got that like old school jerky snake feeling, which is fine. Um, I also think it's a funny joke that this is the Apple logo, but maybe that's just me. I used to have a bunch of things in here like the ability to select other snakes and things like that. I think that most people were skipping through that in the workshop, which is part of the reason I removed it. And now it's just kind of like, okay, what's the minimal game restart that we can build into this? Because I do want to mention app state, right? I do want to mention states and substates and like, can you pause and things like that. But I don't want to give people the overhead of needing to deal with, oh, that's the thing that I tell people to do afterwards. There's, technically speaking, there's a bug where if you push backwards, like you're going up and you push backwards, the snake will hit itself because it tries to move down. That's one of the things that I tell people to try to fix after the workshop, because it doesn't impact gameplay all that much, but it does like end your game in a way that is not supposed to be ended. Position. One of the things we have to do in this workshop is basically like figure out where things are relative to the currently like accessible entity, if that makes sense. Let's see, do we have any unwraps in here? This is one of the older workshops in general, so it's easy to think that something could have snuck in from like an old version and that I just haven't dealt with it yet. So for example, this, right? We're unwrapping all over the place here, but now we have result. So at the very least, all of these can be question mark, right? This whole thing needs to Return okay if we do that. Perfect. And everything still works. One more unwrap. 173. I think now that this is in, it's worth stopping the unwrap spam. I include little graphics for like, hey, this snake texture is like got a north and an east next to it. And then like which one we need to actually render. This is the render stake segments system. Yada, yada, yada. I think everything here is fine. I don't think tile position has any kind of like is next to or whatever. We do have one giant tick function here. I'll say that I've never been super happy about this one function. It's 128 to 50, so it's like it's not even that big. But like and it makes sense for the game, right? Like here's our tick. We tick on every 0.1 seconds or something like that, right? We could do something fancier, have a resource, drive this via run system based on that resource, whatever. I chose not to do that kind of thing. I think this being a later one is also really good because it means that I can kind of like skip a lot of explanation. One of the reasons the Snake Workshop got to be so big is because it was trying to explain introductory concepts and also things that were actually relevant to the workshop. Right? Like if you're already familiar with observers and triggering observers, then I don't need to explain to you what this is doing. I can just say we're going to use a spawn event. And actually this spawn snake segment event might not even be necessary. Let's take a look at, here's our trigger for it, right? We look at the tile map and whatnot, build a new tile entity at a position, set it in storage. So like this like set it in storage kind of thing makes a little bit of sense. The idea that we have like other things that we need to handle makes this make sense. I think if this was just this spawn command, it wouldn't. But because we have like additional stuff, like to put a snake segment into the map, we have to spawn the tile entity, add the tile entity to our index, and also make sure the snake segments are keeping track of like the order of the snake segments. So I think that's fine. Let's look for like width. Everything's good there. We don't have any like extraneous things that could be ported to the new children or like parent child or whatever. The thinking about relationships, right? The snake could be a relationship-based linked list, which would be kind of weird. We only have one to many, which would be the relationship type that we would use. I can't think of a way in which that would make sense. Like technically snake segments are part of the snake body, right? So you could like put a like segment of component onto a snake segment that could associate it with the parent snake entity. We still need to order it. Technically speaking, I think relationships actually keep the order in which they were inserted. I don't know if that's like a hard how do I frame that? I don't know if that's like a hard API commitment is the way that I'll frame it. I think it has to be. There's some sort of ordered collection you can use with a relation. I think at the very least, the parent-child stuff has to be ordered. So if we go look at child of, right, this is going to implement relationship. And it's got a target, and the target is children, and there's nothing special about this relationship implementation, right? And if we go look at children, there's nothing special about the implementation. They do linked spawn here, but I think linked spawn is not related to us. I think linked spawn is... If this is true, when despawning or cloning, the related entities targeting this entity will also be despawned or cloned. So if we despawned a snake, theoretically, then everything would get despawned. That's cool. I think that the order is required. Because for parent children, the order is required. Like this is non-negotiable in that sense. It has to be in order. Because if you do, for example, UI work, you don't want that UI work being in random places based on when it decided to render. So it might be worth, actually. Let's see, what changes do we have here? I think we have only good changes right now and version changes. So let me use 0.16 idioms. That's a terrible commit message, but... So we have snake, right? And right now snake is a resource. To do this, we would have to make snake an entity. And that would be fine. What is the... There's a trait ordered relationship source collection? Really? Does this implement that? Did I just miss it? Reflects. Relationship target, alias, component. It's not derived. Does it... This trait signals that a relationship source collection is ordered. Okay. And this would have an implementation for, yeah, okay. So I don't know that this is particularly relevant in the sense that we don't need to manually implement it. Because if it's always like, it would be a vec for us for the relationship. I think the actual, I can't remember if the custom container got reverted and not re-added, or if it just got reverted. I didn't check, but I think that making it a vec makes it ordered, so we wouldn't have to worry about it. We don't need to like additionally implement this. So the naming for that would be really weird. It would be like segment of and snake, I guess, or segment of and segments, something like that. We are using a vec deck currently. I don't necessarily think we need to. But I'll have to make sure that some of the logic would work. Right? Because this would end up just being... I don't know that it's substantial enough to make this change. I think that because this is a one-player game, this snake is always going to be that parent. We already have a vec. We never... It would be an interesting time to do the relationship stuff for sure. Rasmute snake. Just looking at all of the ways that we use. I think the only time I ever push is push front, right? Vec deck. Right. Okay. So I remember why I used the vec deck now. Basically, if we do a vec, right, a snake will grab an apple, the snake's head grows, which is why we push onto the front. So we would have to be able to use the vec deck. And I think that... Let's look at ordered. We would then have to implement ordered relationship source collection for that vec deck, which means that we would have to implement it for a new type wrapper around the vec deck. And then I think that that starts to get into, this is kind of weird. I think if there was a vec deck implementation for this, that would make more sense. Bevy PR? Yeah. It could be, right? I think that it's not clear. Oh no, actually, you know what? Hang on. Look at this. Ordered relationship source collection. Provided methods. Push front, push back. This is set up to do that. There's no implementation for it. I don't think. Right? I don't know that there's a single implementation for it. Because, let's see, insert looks like a specific index. Remove, insert stable, remove stable. Sort, insert sorted, place. Like, this is definitely possible. I can't think of the spawning APIs that would let you access this intentionally. Right, like related would let you specify the order. But if you spawn child of, right? If you say this is a child of that, there's no spawn head, right? There's no like... Let's check for spawn. Spawn one related. Spawn and spawn one. Is the order just based on entity ord? No. You mean the ordered in snake or the ordered in the traits? The ordered in the traits is just the vec order, as far as I can tell. So like vec and small vec, 0 index, 1 index, 2 index, 3 index, like that. Like ordered like that. Not relating to the entity. Relating to the order of insertion, actually, is what it comes down to. I don't think spawn one. I don't know that there's an API for spawning in a specific location. Right. I don't know if there's a spawn for the head, which I think is fine in the sense that if we used a vec and we always insert it onto the end is the head. And then we just need to do a dot reverse on every iteration. So like that could work. It would be nicer if we could just take advantage of the vec deck as it currently exists. Where do I see this? RG head. Right, like this is snake segments, iter, tuple, windows, next currently. So we just get 0. It's just kind of nice to work with this like this. I think like .rev works here. I don't think there's anything wrong with it in terms of code. But we would need to do that if we were popping on or pushing onto the end over and over. Right? This will be weird because it's no longer, you know, doing the right thing. But that would work. We would just have to iterate from the end up. We don't have any special like snake head component, so it's not like we need to keep moving the snake head. The snake head is just like based on the vec position. So I could get rid of the snake vec deck. Then I believe we could, instead of snake segments, this would be like segment of snake, right? We still need the tile storage, so this doesn't like, we don't win anything in terms of needing this to not be a thing anymore. We would need to query for snake. We already are doing that, so that's fine. So it's really, it comes down to this is the improvement. We would need to reverse in the other location, and we could get rid of this in favor of segment of snake. And then anytime we do the query, so we query for it when rendering, for example, here, right? Render snake segments, we get the snake. We would do, I guess, the snake labeled entity and its segments as a query. And then it's the same thing here, just with .rev. Showing impl of ordered relationship source collection could be cool too. I don't think it's necessary for this workshop. I don't think implementing it helps. Because how would you use this? Right? Like this is implemented for vec. Right? If this is implemented for vec, that implies to me that I'm not supposed to touch it, because the only thing you're supposed to touch is the source of truth component, right? So this is like a backing store that is one step of abstraction away. So then the question is, you have to implement this for vecdeck in a way that pushes front only. And I think there's two implementations for vecdeck if it does that. So you would have to do new type around the vecdeck, implement this for it, implement it in such a way that it always called push front. You get a push front for vec by implementing this? Do you really? I guess you get it. Okay. So you kind of like get it through index-based insertion. You don't get. Right. And these are just default implementations, so we could override them with the actual push front from vecdeck. So doing the implementation isn't a problem. But then this is used, I think this is just used behind the scenes. Right? I think I actually need to go to Git to look for where this is actually required / used. Let's do RG this. So this is in literally two places: related methods and relationship source collection. Relationship source collection is the implementation for vec, and small vac. And then it's used in related methods. So let's go check out related methods. Bevy ECS source relationship related methods. Bevy ECS source relationship related methods. So this is where we get our ordered stuff. So insert related is the function on the world. Entity world, sorry. It's a big difference. So entity.insert related, so like commands.entity.insert related, right? This has to implement ordered relationship source collection. Interesting that it has to implement this. This is non-optional. So I wonder if hash maps, I feel like hash maps were merged and then unmerged at one point. Entity reservation V9. What was I going to search for? I already forgot. Ordered relationship source collection. I don't remember which issue this is. This is the... It was a reversion, so maybe it's like recent. Ordering your systems, wrong. Method column replacement, output curve, never say never. Partial support. I swear this had revert in the title. What a PR title. Revert attempts to fix memory leak. One-to-one relationships didn't get reverted. They just panic if you try to add another one. I think in the future, the goal is to just like replace one with the other instead of panicking. Never say never. System param validation with related to work with a bundle. Can't remember anything else about the issue title, unfortunately. We look for a relationship. Contains relationship macro. If I can't find it on this search, then I'm just not going to look for it anymore. Which PR for you to look to? I'm looking for, there was a reversion for like generic relationship collections. Like relationship collection is a hash map kind of thing. And I can't remember what it specifically said in the issue or the PR or whatever. Am I only looking in PRs too? Maybe I should look higher level. The relationship hash map. Kinded entities. Pull requests. I don't know. I think I'm tapped out on. It's rare that I can't find one that I was looking for, but um you know what I might do? I think this is the person working on it. $17,447. Let's find out. Well, that's not how you type a number. Support non-vec data structures and relationships. Yeah, I think this is going to be it. Yeah. The existing relationship source collection uses vec as the only possible backing for relationships. This tried to implement relationship source collection for entity hash set. And this got merged and was in RC1, but then got reverted. This seems like something that got merged, and this is where the small vec implementation came from. Undone by 18,413. There we go. Re-export entity set collections and entity module. That's why. Because I remember this being related, but it didn't have a title that was related. I think this removed functionality as well. This isn't just a re-export PR, if I remember correctly. This is a removal of the behavior of being able to use a hash map. Hash map or hash shut. I was thinking hash map off the top of my head, but really what I was thinking about is for Snake, we would have to be able to implement ordered relationships for a vec deck, but because it's the ordered relationship collection trait, then that is only used in certain locations, of which I don't think we even have the APIs to tap into it at the moment. And it doesn't matter that that specific PR got reverted, but like this has ordered relationship source collection, right? So that's R. R here is related. So related iter enumerate get. This doesn't rely on that. This is insert related. So this inserts a batch of related stuff. So this is the stuff that you're going to insert, get mute, and then it uses dot place with an index. And the index is the index of, okay, so maybe we can actually insert related here, takes an index, and related stuff. So if we commands entity, we could potentially insert at the beginning. Insert related, Q entity insert related. This is on, I guess that's on entity command. Yeah, it's on entity commands. Why is it showing me entity? Okay, GitHub's header didn't update. I knew that was a commands related thing. Typically all commands things have very short implementations like this that call out to the actual implementations. So theoretically, insert related with the index and whatever is related would insert at 0. We only ever grow by 1, so that works for us, but I think it works on a technicality. I don't feel good about needing to be like, oh, if I teach this, for example, right? If I say, we're going to do snake, we're going to use relationships for the snake segments. We are going to use insert related with an index. That means that you can only ever, I guess that's not true because these are commands, they'll get sequenced. So if you do commands.insert related at 0 and then another commands insert related at 0, it will keep going. I think this would work. So the big change here would be that would be insert related on self. Self here is entity commands. So commands entity insert related. So we would get the snake entity insert related. And then spawn this. Could work. Do I have the commits here? I do have commits here. We could try it, at least. I don't know that it's overall a win, but we'll find out. So first snake then, we would have, when do we use snake segment? That's the other thing. So RG snake segment. This is used in a couple places. It's just a marker, right? We use it when we do the insertion. Yeah, we do use it when we do the insertion, so we'll keep it. This is what's going to go away. Because the snake will be a entity instead. The question I have around that is, if the snake is an entity, is this the right time to introduce non-transform having entities? I feel like for the most part, you can ignore that kind of thing, right? Where, like if we did commands.spawn snake, right? And snake was a component. This is an entity with the snake component, doesn't have a transform, doesn't have anything. This is a totally reasonable thing to do, especially if we then like insert related, you know, 0 bunch of stuff segments, right? Like this is totally reasonable. It's a little like down the road of ECS understanding, if that makes sense, right? I think it's easy to think of a resource as a piece of global state, right? And then you just get that resource and you look in the resource and you have your stuff. This is very like ECSy, where we're going to have, theoretically, if we had resources as entities, then this would be effectively the same thing, right? Like we would have the snake as an entity. It doesn't have a transform. It's got related stuff. Theoretically, we could spawn 4 of them and have 4 players, and they would have their own related segments, so on and so forth. But it's still a little bit weird from the like casual perspective, or like the early perspective. I guess this is going to be one of the later workshops, so it's okay. Segments, right? Is there a special thing we should be using here? Entity vec or something? Doesn't look like it. We'll just go with vec of entity for the moment. So component snake has segments that are vec of entities. This is, I forget which one to put there. We're going to go look at the syntax. That's the other thing. As soon as 0.16 drops, I want to have a relationship video ready to go. I tried to make one during 0.15, and I think there was a little bit too much turmoil to like make a useful video, especially with like child of changing back and forth between a tuple and a field and whatnot. So I roughly want this. I don't want it child of. I want it, I guess, snake segment. I feel like the naming for segment of is really weird. I don't know how other people feel about it. I'm very curious as to how other people feel about it. Because, like, if this is snake segment, snake, this is basically the same conversation they had about child of, where it would be like parent here. So this would be like segment of entity, right? And then you would have to query for segment of if you wanted to query for snake segments. Bike shed. Yeah. I just this in particular feels very confusing to explain to people. And I want to make sure that I am either aligning with the way that it works in Bevy or I have a good way to explain it. And I just don't really feel like I have a good explanation of like what these things are by their names, right? Isn't this no longer true? Didn't this get changed back to a tuple? I guess it's weird to have both of them like this, but not that terrible. Relationship target. I guess we don't need to derive relationship, right? This would be snake. See, now this feels weird too. So segment of snake, derived component, relationship target, relationship. Linked spawn is something we want. I want to be able to despawn a snake and have all the segments disappear. I guess this is just a vec of entities. We could match, and that would be fine. I feel like there's an attribute that I'm not seeing in the docs. Oh, relationship and target can only be derived for structs with a single unnamed field, single named field, or for named structs where one field is annotated with relationship. Okay, so it's the same one for both of them. So if we did this, then this is the correct syntax. Doesn't look right. That doesn't look like it's compiling. We have other issues, but I don't think this is compiling. We don't have additional snake information, so it doesn't really matter for us. Oh, it can't be pub. So you're saying this works. It does. Interesting. That makes sense because we're not supposed to touch it. There's no error here that would have told me that, right? Like unsatisfied trait bound, yes. But there's no, like it doesn't tell me that I can't put pub on it. Oh well. So that's fine. Segment of, whenever we query for snake segments, it's going to be a little bit weird because like the query is going to be like a query for segment of, which I feel like doesn't explain what it's doing. I want to match child of, I think. The only other option is to rename this with a field called snake. And then you have like segment of dot snake, I guess. Let's stick with this for now. We really don't need this to be a struct, but I'm going to leave it like this for a moment. So we have our relationship defined. This was a vec deck and it's now a vec. So we are going to have to reverse some of the iteration, and that is not going to be a thing that the compiler lets us or tells us about. So snake plugin then, we need to spawn a snake when we start, right? So we were inserting that snake previously, but now if we start a new game, where's our reset system? Right, reset game. Right, and this is commands trigger snake spawn snake or spawn snake segment event or whatever. So this could be like do we have a query for snake here? We kind of do. Here we're just resetting it to default. So we could like query for snake. There's only ever going to be one. So we could single for entity snake. This doesn't need to be mutable, right? Single entity snake. Commands dot entity snake dot despawn, right? And then theoretically that despawns everything for us, so we don't need to look for positions at all. Because if we despawn the snake, then all of the tiles get despawned. The positions here are things with snake segments. So I guess we get to remove this. And now this is just food. So we keep this. We say if there's food, then that is food. Not a huge win there, but a little bit cleaner on the width. So we get our snake. We despawn it. We despawn it recursive because of the way we set up the relationship. In this case, I have spawn events. So we need to spawn a new snake. I think this is interesting because that can only be private, right? So this has to be what? Snake default? Right? Like this has to derive default because we can't have access to segments. So this has to be snake default, right? Oh, that is not the way that I wanted to write that. And this will be a dereference. So we despawn the old one, we spawn a new one, and then we trigger a couple of position additions. This could be its own spawn, but our spawn logic is a little bit more complicated than that, I think. Right? This is, let's do single snake here. I don't remember what we use this for. It's probably going to want to be the entity, right? With snake. So in this spawn for each segment, we say, hey, spawn it at this tile position, right? That's what the event has. We grab things like the tile storage. Tile storage is something we need to insert every time we spawn a snake segment. So I think using an observer for this is fine. Because the alternative is we have to get access to those entity IDs anyway to put them into the tile storage. And getting access to those IDs puts us back in the old world of like spawn something, grab the ID, and then put it in. So I think this is a design consideration for ECS tile map, actually. We'll see. We're about to move to required components there, so we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, I think we'll keep the observer because we're working with the relationship stuff right now. So snake, right? Segment of snake. And then this goes away. So the only way we could insert related at 0, right, is if we were inserting onto the snake so do we then do commands.entity snake dot insert related 0 and then this tile bundle, which we don't need to specify segment of on anymore because that should be automatic, right? So we end up with I guess this tile bundle is one thing, so we don't really need the paren. What's wrong with this is a question. In my head, insert related allowed us to insert any bundle and it would automatically insert the related component on it for us. But maybe I was wrong. Snake segment. Snake is not a resource. That's true, true, true. Render snake, snake segments, segments. This is snake 207. Isn't it generic? There's something off about it. Expected reference of array of stuff. It's this. Something like that. Oh, it's an array of entities, actually. It is not interesting. Okay, so spawn related? Clone and spawn with? No. Does insert related benefit from the spawn related struct? Right, spawn related. Like this. This feels really awkward. I feel like that can't possibly be correct. It wants this to be entities. So really what it wants is this. Well, it is an entity now, so I'm not sure what the issue is there. Snake segment, res mute, snake, yada yada. Segments. My list of gigantic errors is not helping me right now. After tick, segments, segments, there we go. Expected entity found entity commands.id, which is probably what Hukasi just said in chat. Yeah. Yep. So insert related R. So we need to specify the relation. The question is, if I mess this up, right? If this is snake, we get an error. Okay, cool. So this is the spawning pattern then for that relation. Do we have anything else? I don't like that. Relationship target methods that create a bundle with a dynamic bundle effect that contains the relationship target component. I can already never remember which of these is the source of truth and which one is the collection. The component containing the collection of entities that relate to this entity. Okay, so this containing the entities that relate to this entity. So those entities would then have segment of on them. Spawn related is a trait. So what was I actually thinking of? Because children... Doesn't children desugar to spawn with and spawn related? Did I think of that? Spawn with is also a trait then? No, spawn with is a struct. So what was I thinking? Spawn one related? Spawn iter is what I was thinking of. It's spawn, spawn iter, and spawn with. Not easy to discover how this works from the docs, gonna be honest. I feel like I've seen a number of examples and the names for these things, perhaps because I followed while they were flowing back and forth, but also just generally feels weird. A relationship should be somewhere in here. Spawn. Yeah, if we just spawn it with the component, that should be enough. With related, or with related entities. So insert related is not... Like, that's what we want to use because otherwise it has to go to the end of the vec. If it goes to the end of the vec, that's fine, but we have to reverse the way that we work with it everywhere. Right? With related does exist here. So we can do with related segment of, and then tile bundle. So theoretically this should work. This is better. Does this actually return the tile entity now is the other question. Which entity does this return, right? Commands.entity snake with related, right? We need the ID of the tile bundle to put into tile storage. And with related returns what? With related returns entity commands for the root. It has to be for the root, right? Because like it has to be for the snake. So I don't think that this is the way that we're going to do this. Right? Commands.spawn this. Segment of snake. I think this is what we need. Right? Because we need the ID of the tile bundle. We can put segment of snake here. This seems fine. Aside from the tile storage, which I was trying to abstract away a little bit. The other thing is that like we would need to set up snake texture index and whatnot. So like this could be a command instead of a observer. I think that the reason it's an observer and not a command implementation is that it's easier for people who are writing Bevy apps to write systems. I think the jump from writing systems with system params to world access is a jump. The kind of jump that might warrant a dedicated workshop. Because like it's fine, but all of your access patterns change. Right? When you write a system, that is the same way that you write everything else. Working with that system, even though this is an observer, it's commands.trigger, it looks a little weird when you're trying to spawn it. Because like theoretically, if we spawn snake here and we do .with related, right? And we then spawn the tile positions in there, we still need the IDs of the tile positions, right? So they still need to be separate spawns anyway. This could be the spawn command that we have over here. But then we pull in all of this extra stuff, right? Like the snake tile, the snake segment needs to know that it's a tile. It needs to know which tile entity it's attached to. It needs to know which texture to use to start with. Like, and maybe this isn't true per se because we have a system to handle that. But I think that our two options for these are either do it with an observer or do it with a command. And I think doing it with the observer is fine for now. The question here is, we're doing everything in reversed order. So we can no longer spawn it like this. We have to spawn it like this. And then we have a whole bunch of other code to update. So bunch of unresolved import kind of stuff. Let's go start with lib, I guess. Snake segment of does exist. This is no longer this. This is a single entity with snake if we need it. This is how we access this now. We don't need to mutate it. This is segment of, right? Which I guess technically speaking, do we not need? Because if we query for snake, we already get all of those. We're looking for the tile positions, which we have to get via entity anyway, right? Positions.get snake segments, right? We have to do that anyway. This is with and without food. So I don't think we can crush this down. Right? Snake.segments is now private. So snake.iter is now implemented because of that relationship. That gives us the entity probably, right? Let's go check the docs, see if that's a thing. Relationship. Relationship target, iter, collection. Self.collection as relationship source collection, source iter. Okay, so collection as source collection, source collection, source iter. So this is just iterating over source iter. Source iter is an iterator over entities. So if we iter, we get entities. We can only iter, so we can't do indexed access. So it would have to be snake.iter.next question mark. Question mark. Iter is causing an issue. What is iter up to? Iter, snake.iter, method not found in single. So does this need to be dereferenced before we do that? I guess single entity with snake. We actually need the snake, right? So single snake. Then this is snake.iter. Question mark is an option. So this would need to be like okay or. So at this point, snake should have at least one segment. This is for every tick. We don't encode that in any of our other code, so it's a little bit weird, but so next position would be this. Is this the next position? I think not. I think this is actually last. Because we have to do everything in reverse now, right? We have to get to the head. So we have to iterate over, we have to get the last entity. Segments.length, snake dot iter dot count, right? Is that the same thing? Length and count? I think so. So this would be pop back. Because we're despawning the tail. which is a little bit awkward, I feel like. So iter dot net dot, we can't take this off, can we? We have to iter dot next to get the entity to then despawn via commands dot entity. And if we despawn it, then it gets removed. So this would be, we can remove this then because that just happens on the next line, right? So theoretically this despawns. And this is looking for the tile storage to remove it. This doesn't happen until the function is over. It looks a little awkward, but we should be able to get it there. Starting to feel the hunger come in. Got a little bit more to do. Food, snake segment. So snake 81. This is single snake. This is segment of. And then after I do all of this, I'm basically going to look at this and go, is this worth it or not? Food, segment of. And then we need to iter reversed on the other iters, which is not something that Rust can enforce for us. So I think, well, there's other issues, but where do we query for snake? This is in lib, so iter last and iter count. So now this runs, technically speaking. But we don't actually spawn anything in. Because we don't have the initial snake. Is that the issue? Because we don't reset the very first time. Let's see, where have we changed things? We've changed things in tick. We've changed things in reset. Reset queries for single. Reset isn't running if there's no snake. Where's reset? I feel like it should have warned me about that. So maybe there's something else going on. Because reset runs when we enter the playing state. Reset has to run here, so this has to print. But this, I think, prevents the system from running because there is no snake. Because we moved it from a resource and the resource no longer exists. So like hit new game and that doesn't run, but it also doesn't warn. So really, this is option single, right? If let some snake equals snake, then we despawn. So the snake is definitely hitting itself. Maybe I made a mistake in ordering these. I don't think so. But I guess I reversed all of the iterations, so it should be fine. Our snake is now moving backwards through life. So, you know, getting everything from the other direction. So that means that our render snake system needs some updates. This is render snake. We go for our single snake here, and like this is no longer head, right? This didn't warn us because segments is inaccessible to everybody else, but not inside of this. That's really awkward. Okay, segments.iter needs to become iter.reverse in general. So dot reverse here, dot reverse there. And that's all fine. And if you move it out of this file, then you can't do dot segments, but otherwise it's fine. And that is the fix. So snake is working, and we are now using relationships for the snake and its segments, and it is despawning when we want it to despawn, and it's doing everything we need it to do, and we are no longer using a resource to manage this. We are using relationships. So the question becomes, at this point, is it worth it? First is not available. First, I forget iter first. I think I habitually go to next. I don't remember what the first situation is. I feel like next is first, so like I feel like I don't think first exists. Yeah. First doesn't exist. Because next is first. Right? So it would just be an alias. I guess you're talking about maybe slice first. I don't remember when you made that comment in chat, so I don't know exactly what you were referring to. Right, reverse tuple windows next. These are iterators by definition, right? So this is snake segments iter reverse tuple windows next. This has to be next because it's an iterator, but segments iter reverse theoretically could get, no, can't get last. Kind of have to do it this way. Same thing here. We could not write it this way, but this is the most obvious way to write it. So snake segments, tuple windows, and then we reverse the order of these two, and this would work. But I think this is more obvious. Like everywhere else, we have the same thing. So I'm going to keep it like this, even though we could write it without doing this reverse. I think the clarity is important there. And then from reverse, front origin back. All of that works. Where was the other place we were doing itters? We were doing itters in lib or main. Where's .next? .next is used in lib. So snake doesn't allow us access to segments. So we actually can't use first because we can't do segments .first because segments is not public, and apparently the trait enforces that. That's an interesting note, because we switched from snake being a resource to snake being this set of relationship components. So snake.segments is no longer a freely accessible field because we cannot make this public. We get a whole bunch of errors, but really it's unsatisfied trait bound. The collection and relationship target must be private to prevent users from directly mutating it, which could invalidate the correctness of relationships. So we're not supposed to access this. The fact that we can here is not supposed to happen, right? So maybe I don't do that at all in the first place. Looks like we get a slightly different output from that iterator. So maybe we need fewer. Yeah, we need fewer dereferences. That's actually even better, honestly. I love not having to dereference all this stuff. So I think that even though we do have access to it here because we're in the same module, I don't actually want to use it. Because the intent for all other usage is that you don't touch that. So I think touching it there doesn't make sense just because we can. We should try to align with the intended usage. And then when somebody moves that code out to a different file, they aren't confused as to why it is an issue. Right? And everything still works, so everything's still great. So the question is making this a relationship worth it? I haven't made a decision yet. Snake, let's get rid of this vec deck up here. And let's take a look at the diff. Let's see what actual changes are required here. So for some things, this positions, which I could take another look at positions too and see if this is even relevant anymore. Because for this positions, this is new food event triggers. We need basically everything that is on the board. Does that even need to be a query? This is new food event triggers. So this is a query for tile positions with segment of or food. I think this is basically an early safe list. We don't technically need to filter this down. We would need to. We do use two tile maps. We use one for the background and one for the snake. So if we don't filter this down, then we end up with tile positions in the wrong tile map. These are all tile positions. We could also get the tile storage here. I don't see that being significantly better. Either way, not really related to the segment of, or not really related to the relationship change. So I think that query is fine. Doesn't really change that much. These queries also don't really change this much. There's a new concept introduced by doing this, and it's the concept of entities that are not visible things, which technically is around all the time anyway, right? Like observers are entities that aren't visible, et cetera, et cetera. But that's kind of hidden from you in a lot of different ways. So like an observer creates a new entity and it attaches the observer component onto it, right? Like that kind of thing. You, as a person calling add observer, never really sees or interacts with that entity for the most part. So in that way, this concept is kind of hidden from most people, but I think it's a useful concept. Like entities are things with components. They aren't just visible things, right? Entities have component bags attached to them effectively. And those component bags don't have to have a transform, a material, and a mesh. Or a sprite. And especially with the relationships, that becomes a little bit more interesting. So this next position then, snake iter last, no reverse. Snake should have a last component. That makes sense. I don't know that we really get away from doing that. We get away from doing like, we are no longer allowed to do arbitrary index access because we don't have access to segments. So some people are going to look at this and go, I don't want to call iter. But I don't think that matters because here iter doesn't really do much. Right? I think that people need to understand that calling last doesn't necessarily mean like performance issue. So I think that's an aesthetic thing really in this case. Iter.count, same kind of thing. I think count shortcuts. Segments pop back iter next. So we're relying, instead of removing it from the segments, we are now despawning it and relying on the despawn to remove it. Which is interesting. Not really better or worse, I think. Kind of nice that if you despawn it, then it gets removed. Reset game now has to query for option single. You like it because it ensures consistency between the entity and the relationship. You mean the despawning versus removing from the back? Yeah, I think I agree with that. Snake. Not really anything super interesting here. Basically a single query for the snake. We didn't need positions anymore because positions became food. Technically, we don't need with tile pause there anymore either. If we're just looking for food and we're despawning all food, then it doesn't need to be food with a tile pause. It just needs to be food. So we could simplify that query. I think despawning the snake is really nice because despawning the snake implies that everything else is going to get despawned now, which I really do like. We get rid of the vecdeck. The vecdeck is, I don't know. I like the vecdeck is fine. It's a new data structure to most people. I think thinking about pushing things in from the back or the front is weird, but that's weird no matter what. No more snake resource, the relationship. I think because you can't access segments, I'll turn this back into a tuple because snake itself can't really hold anything else. So it doesn't really matter because we always have to call .iter anyway because this is a private field. So it doesn't matter whether this is named segments or not. It's really just kind of like a documentation thing more than anything. So I'm going to leave it actually for documentation purposes. Then everything needs to reverse when we do the iter because the head is at the end of the vec now instead of the beginning. But that's fine. We can just be like, hey, when we put stuff in, we push it in on the end. Or do we push it in on the end? Yes. We push it in on the end and we look at the beginning for the thing to take off. And that's fine. I don't think that's particularly efficient because we're pulling things off item 0 of a vec. But I think anybody who's complaining about the performance of removing one item from a list of a maximum of like 300 is a little over performancing. Could do a snake segments component that's self-documenting, though you like snake being the relationship too. Snake segments component. You mean name it snake segments and then yeah, I think it's the defining component for a snake. So I think I might leave it, but I like what you're getting at there for sure. If it was an unrelated relationship, maybe. But we never access snake without accessing the segments. So I don't think in this case it actually makes much of a difference. But I do like the idea of that relationship could be separate and have a different marker component. That said, we end up with basically just a bunch of gets here and stuff. That's all fine. We reverse and we do the same thing we were doing before. So fundamentally, overall, this is not a hugely impactful change. I think that I'm going to do it. I think this is the way that it's going to be. I think it might be useful to look at this and go, it's awkward to insert like that. Therefore, Bevy might benefit from an API that does this, right? Like, how do you do a VecDeck implementation of an ordered relationship collection is an open question in my mind right now. Because if we could do that, then I think that implies, well, two things. One, we could use this to inform potential changes to the Bevy API. Two, we could use this to inform potential changes to the ECS tilemap API. Because in this case, which is granted, this is not a particularly amazing, like, ECS tilemap use case, right? It's Snake. It's not, you know, Terraria or something. You do think the relationship stuff in Bevy could be more flexible? Yeah, I mean, I do think it is intended to be as well. There's going to be many relationships, and there's going to be other things like that. So, yeah, TBD. I think that overall, the big changes here are basically we have to iter reversed. And theoretically, if we cared about the performance of removing index 0 on a vec, we wouldn't be able to get around that, I don't think. or we would have to do this in a different way. But there are things I like about this, right? Like I like the idea of introducing, hey, we could spawn a snake and that snake doesn't have to have like position information. It can just be like, hey, we have a snake entity. Because I think this makes it more obvious how you would do multiple snakes, right? We could spawn multiple snakes. Our snake spawn segment event doesn't work for multiple snakes, but this could be a path into multiplayer. So like, I think I'm okay with this. I think this is use relationships. I think this is what I'm going to do with the next snake iteration. This makes it a, like that didn't really change the amount of code in it, right? This is still a 700 line workshop. This as an observer versus this as a command is, you know, like 50-50. Like it doesn't, I don't think it matters either way. Right? Because either way, we need to define this struct and then queue the struct. So they're basically the same thing fundamentally to a user who's coming to this workshop. The only difference is, do I get to use commands.trigger and use system parameters to access my data, or do I do commands.queue and do I have to do world access? And I think doing world access is more annoying than doing trigger and observer access. And they effectively function the same anyway. So I think the observer is here to stay. And then relative position is basically a helper. Bevy ECS tile map is not required. I might remove it. Or not tile map, sorry. Bevy asset loader is not required. I think that one of the things that Bevy ECS tile map does for us in this workshop is reduce the amount of code that we need to write, because otherwise we need to do a board implementation ourselves. And currently the only code that we need to write for that is spawn this. We don't have to do like a tile position component and whatnot. Because if we look at the 2048 workshop, 2048 requires its own board implementation. Which is just like a little bit annoying. Right? This board, we've got to build struct board. We've got to decide what fields it has. We have to do these like new and like, how do you translate into a world position and things like that. Like all of those kinds of things, accessing tiles by tile position, etc. Those are all pre-built with Bevy ECS tile map. So that's really getting rid of all of that like fiddly code for us, which I like. It occurs to me that we just did a relationships refactor on Snake, and should we do a relationships refactor for these boards? I don't think so. There's no real relationship there. Like there is a relationship, like it's board to tile, but in 2048, it doesn't really matter. But then why relationship instead of children? Could you expand on that? I can't connect that to the exact words that I said. Also, the other thing I'll mention is children is a relationship. So children is a relationship of a specific kind, right? It's a parent-child relationship. That's also how transform propagation tends to work. So if you opt into being a parent-child relationship, you opt into certain things about that. The board here, I don't think that there is really... So we could do board tiles, right? But there's no... Because of the way 2048 works, you end up having to look at the board in 4 different directions. And iterating over them is not that useful from a hierarchy perspective, I think. Like if we did board.iter, that would iter over all available tiles as entities. So theoretically, board.tiles is just iterating over all the tiles. This tile, in this case, is a position. So in this case, we're basically spawning a bunch of tiles. The board that we spawn in here could be an entity. It could be sized. It could relate to a whole bunch of other stuff. I think the board in 2048 is not the interesting part of the workshop, is the other thing. So like building out a full board abstraction is not really the point. So any shortcuts we can take there is actually good, because 2048 has this weirdly complex board shift function that needs to be generic in 4 directions. So you need to get all the tiles, sort them in the right order, and then perform some operations on them. And that logic is kind of annoying to write. And I don't think having any board abstractions helps us there. But maybe. I don't know. I'll put a little bit of thought into it. It's getting to the end of stream, so I think I'm going to wrap up rather than doing the same refactor here and seeing if it's better. But I'll probably try this refactor here and see if it makes sense. Let's see, what do we get for this command? This command gets the board, gets the asset server for the font, and then does a spawn. This command doesn't need to exist, I don't think. This can be a function that returns simple bundle, I think. The only downside is the font. I wish setting the default font was easier. Right now you have to like override the default font handle, which is not really something I want to like teach people to do. We also don't get any control over how tiles are stored or where they're stored. So if we were to use board as a relationship to tiles, that really doesn't give us anything. Because the only way that I can tell to insert related, we don't have a lot of control over where those things go. We can insert them into specific indices, but then we have to deal with the logic of figuring out which indice to put it into or which index to put it at for every possible insert, and that sounds annoying. I think immutable components would be interesting, and maintaining an index of those positions, right? Like tile position to entity kind of thing, like tile storage. Now that immutable components are in 0.16, tile storage could actually be an immutable component in ECS tile map. And that tile storage index could be self-updating. But yeah, anyway, always a lot to think about. I think that I'm very interested in making the 2048 and Snake workshops like simpler. I think as workshops start to get larger and larger, I think 2048 is 600, 700, 800, 800, 900 lines. Can you manually run a system and let Bevy handle arguments like query? Yeah. Yeah. You can do that in a number of different ways. Run system is literally a function. Like run system is literally a thing. I think this calls out under the hood to run system cached. If you use the right one, commands run system. Yeah. Run system with one of these is run system cached or run system. There's one of them that doesn't require you to have the system ID, but will create and cache that system ID for you. I just can't remember which one it is. But you can absolutely just run a random system. You could run a random schedule of systems. If you have a world, you can just run system params on the world. So it's really like an open question, right? When you say manually run a system and let Bevy handle the arguments, I guess what are you using it for? Would be the other question. I thought we had a version of this. Yeah, run system cached. Run system cached, runs the cache system, registering it if necessary. So run system cached is what I would tell you to use. Just trying to model systems that are tied to certain entities and that you don't always want running. Sounds like an observer, honestly. You're trying to create a context-sensitive player interaction. Yeah, I would say that if it's context sensitive, like adding a component, having that query for the system look for the component, and then removing the component after the context would be the direction that I would go. It depends on the context, I guess. But yeah, I would think of observers and I would think of systems that query for components that can be optionally there or not there before I would reach for running systems on demand. Imagine an item had a defined action depending on what it is. So an item fires an observer based on after you click it, kind of thing. Like the item. Okay, so an item has an action. The only way that I can think of that being a constraint is if that is something that you want on the struct, which you would then want to run arbitrarily, potentially generically, for that specific item. So you're trying to keep the logic for each of the items inside of an implementation. And I guess you don't have a trait for it. But yeah, anyway, you can run systems cached. Like how in source games, items can have different actions all mapped to E. Yeah, I mean, if you want an action mapped to E, you can fire an observer when somebody hits E, right? And once you fire that observer, you can do whatever you want, including run a cache system or whatever. I think if the things are capable of being observed individually, then you don't really have an issue. You can just do dot observer with the function, right? Like if you have an entity and it has some action that you need to take, if that entity is like clicked on, we'll say, instead of E, then when you click, that should fire the observer on that entity. I guess the other thing would be those entities can have specific components on them. Yeah, I feel like there's a number of different ways to structure it, but without knowing the exact use case, then all I can offer is there's observers, there's components, systems that only run when certain components exist. You can run systems cached. That is totally a thing. I wouldn't necessarily try to overuse that. I would try to use other things first. Separating the interaction from the actual thing that happens is worth thinking about too. So like if you're going to be able to hit E on a bunch of things, all of those things have the like, you know, Eable component on them or whatever. They all fire an observer that then triggers the behavior. And then you can trigger whatever you want inside of that observer, including looking up arbitrary hash maps of stuff that implement traits and calling it. So yeah, anyway, a lot of different ways to do that. For me, I'm about done. It's almost 12, which is my stopping time. I'm going to go eat lunch. Thanks for hanging out, everyone, and I will see you Saturday.